not taking that kid with us. Spoiled, rotten little brat. Well, because he left right in the middle of the ministry. He didn't even say goodbye. He beat us off the ship and he hightailed it back to Mama's house in Jerusalem. Today, I just want to tell you a story. If you remember Peter on the day of Pentecost, it was mayhem. Holy Spirit was poured out. People around there thought the apostles were drunk. Peter stands up and preaches that powerful message, and 5,000 people became Christians that day. And these were not your average come to the market on the weekend kind of people. They were actually influential, wealthy people from all over the world. And there was one lady in the crowd that day. Her name was Mary. She was wealthy and influential as well, and she owned a house in Jerusalem. Her house actually became the headquarters for the apostles in the season following that. There was another move of the Holy Spirit, and people who owned lands and buildings, they sold the properties and they put the money at the apostles' feet, and the apostles distributed the money to everyone that had need. And what that did was got rid of debt in people's lives, and also left them unencumbered, right? So when after that, a big persecution came to Jerusalem and the believers were scattered all over the place, there's nothing holding these people back. They just went wherever they could, except the apostles. They never moved. They all stayed in Jerusalem. And Mary, she didn't sell her house. She still had the house there. And so because of her connections and her influence and maybe some others, the apostles were able to stay in Jerusalem when everybody else was forced to leave. You remember one day Peter was, one night, right? He was put in jail and an angel let him out, and he came back to the house where the believers were praying, and he knocked on the door. That was Mary's house. And Rhoda, Mary's servant, came to the door, and she recognized Peter's voice through the door. So there was that level of familiarity. And of course, there was no husband recorded for Mary there. I don't think he was there. And Peter kind of became like a father figure to Mary's son, who was John Mark. And John Mark was enthralled with Peter. I mean, Peter was his hero. He wasn't old enough to go out, on excursions, preaching the gospel and stuff with those guys. But as he grew up, he was kind of a kid that journaled everything, right? And Peter would tell him stories about Jesus and he would be writing them down. And in fact, that became the Gospel of Mark 70 years later, which was the first gospel written. And then from that point, Mark went on to become the first missionary to Africa, and he began to plant churches down in Egypt. In the meantime, Mark is growing up as a young guy. He's listening to all these stories, and stuff gets a hold of his heart. He's like, go into all the world and preach the gospel. It's like, yes, that's me. He was kind of like your 7 weeks in Asia, YWAM teenager, right? He just wanted to go and do stuff. Well, as all of the believers had been scattered and a bunch went down to Antioch, a church sprang up there. And now the apostles in Jerusalem decided to send teachers and prophets down to Antioch, led by Barnabas, who was actually John Mark's uncle. John Mark decided to go with them. Cool idea. He's old enough now. Uncle Barnabas, can I go too? Yeah, sure. Come on. And so they go down to Antioch, and they're having these tremendous meetings. And Barnabas thinks about Paul or Saul of Tarsus, right? And he goes over to Tarsus, to Damascus, and he finds Saul, and he says, come on, you got to be at these meetings at Antioch. Something amazing is unfolding. And Saul comes back there. They're praying, and the prophetic word comes forth. Separate unto me Saul and Barnabas for the work that I've called them to do. And they laid their hands on them, and they sent them out from the Antioch church as the first missionaries. Well, John Mark went with them. Why not? I mean, just do it. Like, he wasn't sent. There was no prophetic word for him. But just do it, okay? So if you want to go and you're not sent, just go anyway, right? Find somebody and go with them. The guy, of course, he's very young, right? And they're traveling all over, seeing miracles, and it's just absolutely amazing. And they end up planting churches all over the place. They get down to the island of Cyprus. They're kind of stuck on the island now. You can't go anywhere unless you go by ship. And John Mark is kind of in a tough position because he begins to realize that this isn't what he signed up for. And he starts to go in his mind through all of the things. When we left Antioch, my uncle Barnabas was in charge of this team. He was the leader. And now this guy, Saul, who now they call Paul, has become the leader, and Uncle Barnabas is like the associate. And this Paul guy is so intense. We never stop for lunch. We never sleep in good places. There's no day off. We work like crazy. We don't get paid for this. It's just going like crazy. And he's thinking, this is not what I expected it to be. And he's thinking, as soon as we get off this island, man, I'm out of here. I'm gone because this is not right. Sure enough, they sail back to Pamphylia, and Perga is the name of the port where they stop. The gangplank comes down on the ship, and John Mark bolts and he heads back to Jerusalem. Well, he could because Mama still has a house there. And so he's back there where the food's good, servants are doing everything for him again, his clothes are being, laundry's being done, all that kind of stuff. It's just wonderful, doesn't even have to clean his own room. And you think I'm making this up? As time unfolds, the Gentiles begin to get filled with the Holy Spirit and get born again. And there becomes a contention as to should the Gentiles be required to be circumcised like the Jewish Christians. And so Paul and Barnabas head up to Jerusalem to get an answer from the key apostles, right? And they give them an answer, and of course the answer is no, you don't need to be circumcised. But when they get to Jerusalem, they're having these meetings, and they're beginning to tell the stories of what's going on. I mean, amazing miracle stuff that we never expected was going to happen. Especially when the Gentiles get filled with the Holy Spirit and the miracles begin to happen. They're speaking in tongues just like we are. Well, John Mark had snuck into the back of those meetings, right? Because he wanted to hear what was going on. Well, he gets all fired up again, right? And so then when Paul and Barnabas head back to Antioch, guess who goes with them? Mark tagging along again, right? They get to Antioch, and they're there for a while, and they're getting charged up again. And then Barnabas and Paul say, let's go back and visit all the churches that we planted, see how they're doing, encourage them and that kind of thing. And Barnabas says, yeah, we'll take Mark with us. Paul says, we're not taking that kid with us. Spoiled, rotten little brat. And why? Well, because he left right in the middle of the ministry. He didn't even say goodbye. He just wake up in the morning and he's gone, right? No, he beat us off the ship and he hightailed it back to Mama's house in Jerusalem. And he didn't do any work. He was lazy. That's what Paul said about the guy. So they became so divided over this that they actually decided to make two teams. Mark would go with Barnabas and they would go one direction. And then Paul would go another direction. He'd find Timothy and some of those guys and they'd become his team. And of course, as the story unfolds, eventually, John Mark, Paul said, he's useful for me in the ministry, and they become one team again once the guy has grown up, because Barnabas was so good at that. He was just the encourager, right? And he walked, John Mark through all of his struggles and all that kind of thing, and got the things sorted out and explained to him, you know what? Paul and me were different kind of guys, but it doesn't make one right and one wrong. In fact, Paul was very adamant about that. Don't be a follower of Apollos or Paul or whoever, right? This is one body, one kingdom. And so Mark began to understand these things. But what had happened is what happens so often. Well, let me tell you this story. A friend of mine, good friends of our family, was in a church up the road here for 15 years or so, invested a lot in the church, and then one day told me, he says, well, I'm leaving this church. I said, well, why? You've raised your family there, you've poured into that church. He says, well, I finally figured out what's really going on. And what he meant was, he finally figured out all the things that the pastor was doing wrong concerning money, concerning leadership, concerning all this other kind of stuff. What he would call abuses. And he said, my conscience can't allow me to stay there anymore. So what happens is he gets out his measuring tape and he measures the pastor, right? Measures his doctrinal stand, measures, and it's all according to this guy's own thinking, his own morality, right? To say my conscience doesn't allow me to go to that church anymore, it means I'm more of a moral, upright person, more integrity than the pastor, and all this kind of, and you're judging him according to your own standard, your own intentions, right? And so judging him, and then you got to make a decision. Am I going to follow or am I going to break off? And that decision is based on none other than offense. And so then you either break the relationship or you fix this whole thing and get over yourself. Now, there's another church in town just this week. My daughter goes to it, and one of the associates decided he would make a list of everything that's wrong with the senior leader, the pastor. The pastor's a sweet guy, and I haven't met him yet, hoping to soon. But he made a list of all the things wrong with him, and it became a long email, and he emailed it out to all of the congregation members. Well, of course, it just blows the church up. So this associate had measured the pastor according to the standard of his own thinking, and a lot of times what we measure according to is our doctrinal dogma. Well, we don't believe that. Well, there'll be no speaking in tongues around here. Well, we believe in speaking in tongues. I mean, it goes on and on. All these different things that we can decide are more important than having a relationship. And then again, the morality, it can be measured. We can measure the productivity, right? Measure people according to how much we feel like they're producing. whatever standard we want to impose on that. And Jesus said, judge nothing before the time. Like don't do it. It's silly. And the whole idea is, the overarching idea is that love and forgiveness will negate that whole system. How many times have we had people come to Thailand as missionaries particularly, and they come with the idea, look, we just want to carry your bags, that's what they say, and we just want to, we want to help in it, we just want to support you, we really believe in what you're doing, this is absolutely amazing. And then 3 months, 18 months, 2 years later, they're saying, well, this isn't what we expected. This is not what we expect. This isn't what we signed up for. So, well, I don't know what you signed up for. But that's not the issue. The issue is now you're offended at something because, why? Well, because you just don't want to be here. Come on, be honest. Mark just didn't want to be there anymore. It was much better at home. So he found something to be offended by. And your own mind can convince you so clearly and so absolutely adamantly that you're right. But if it's a judgment like that, if it's measuring someone else, it's offense. It's exactly what it is. And we're seeing so much of it. It goes on and on and on. And I just want to encourage you today, tenet number 8 of our Victory Churches, our Victory Church tenets, is that we lead through relationship, not through control. Okay, so and anything that imposes a judgment or a measurement on someone else is a control. But we lead through relationship. That's why we intentionally, as Victory Asia, our number one priority is to invest our resources and our time and everything else into being together. And that's why I speak to you. And into, gathering together in summit. You think about this, pastors. You can have somebody in your group, in your team, in your congregation, whatever it may be, that's really upset with you because they're judging you according to something. And this, it's crazy, because if it's not that, it's something else. It's a hard issue. But if you spend time with them, that whole thing can blow over. And then, 6 months later, they need another visit. We work together through relationship. Relationship comes by investing time in each other. That's the key. How many times has it happened when there's all kinds of things that this is wrong? You go for coffee and pretty soon none of that even matters anymore. And so I just want you to know that I love you, and I think that it's just so neat to be able to walk with people who walk above, who walk in love and forgiveness. And we've been able to walk together for, years and years and years, as all of the nations across Asia. And this story that I just told you about John Mark is probably all true.